"You need to pack up this circus and leave immediately. This is a private community, not a public park." Linda Hartwell's voice carried across the manicured lawn like a whip crack, sharp and unforgiving. Her perfectly styled silver hair caught the afternoon sun as she stood rigid on the cobblestone pathway, clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. At 2:47 p.m. on a picture-perfect Saturday in Maplewood Heights, those words landed like stones thrown at glass. They hit Alicia Parker hard, not because she believed them, but because she had feared them. Alicia Parker, 29 years old, stood in her flowing white wedding dress, the sunlight filtering through the oak trees, casting shadows across the intricate beadwork that had taken her grandmother 6 months to complete by hand. She didn't look like someone causing trouble. She looked like what she was, a bride preparing for the most important photographs of her life. But to Linda Hartwell, president of the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association, she looked like a problem that needed solving. The wedding photographer, Terrell Washington, 31, knelt nearby, adjusting his camera lens, trying to capture the perfect shot of Alicia against the backdrop of the community garden. His assistant, Kiana Price, 24, held a reflector steady, both of them pretending not to hear the commotion building behind them. But the tension was impossible to ignore. Linda marched across the grass in her navy blazer and pressed slacks, her HOA badge gleaming like a badge of authority she'd appointed herself to wield. Behind her followed Gerald Polk, 58, the HOA treasurer, his face flushed red above his polo shirt collar, and Susan Brennan, 45, the secretary, clutching a stack of printed regulations like they were sacred texts. "This is private property," Linda announced again, louder this time. Her voice carried the kind of confidence that comes from years of unopposed authority. "You cannot use our community spaces for commercial photography without written permission from the board, and we certainly don't allow random events that disrupt the peace of our residents." Alicia turned slowly, her veil catching in the gentle breeze. She'd practiced this moment in her mind, knowing it might come to this. Her voice was calm when she spoke, measured and clear. "I'm not random. I live here. Building 47C. I've been a resident for 3 years. Linda's eyes narrowed. "I know every resident in this community. I've never seen you before." Terrell stood up from behind his camera, his jaw tight. "She just told you where she lives. Maybe check your records before you make accusations." Gerald stepped forward, his bulk imposing in the afternoon light. "Are you the photographer? Do you have a commercial permit for Maplewood Heights? Because if you don't, you're trespassing." Kiana lowered her reflector slightly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the still air. "This is insane. She's just taking wedding pictures." Susan consulted her clipboard with exaggerated precision. Commercial photography requires a 72-hour advance notice, a completed application, and approval from the Architectural Review Committee. None of that has been filed. Alicia's hands found the delicate fabric of her dress, smoothing it unconsciously. A nervous habit she'd had since childhood, one that had helped her through job interviews, board presentations, and now this. "The wedding isn't commercial. These are personal photographs in my own neighborhood," Linda scoffed, the sound cutting through the peaceful Saturday afternoon like broken glass. "Your neighborhood? I think not. This is a private community with strict standards. We don't allow just anyone to wander in and treat our common areas like a personal photo studio." The words stung because they carried more than policy. They carried assumption, judgment, and something deeper that Alicia recognized immediately. She'd heard it before at 19 when she'd been followed through department stores. At 24, when a client had asked to speak to her supervisor, assuming she couldn't possibly be the lead architect on the project. And now, at 29, standing in her wedding dress in her own neighborhood. Terrell stepped protectively closer to Alicia, his camera hanging loosely around his neck. "You want to see her lease? Her mail? What exactly would prove to you that she belongs here?" "That's not the point," Gerald interjected, his face growing redder. "The point is procedure. Rules exist for a reason. You can't just show up and expect special treatment." Kiana muttered under her breath, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Special treatment for taking pictures in a place where she pays rent. Susan looked up from her clipboard, her voice sharp with authority. Excuse me, but residents don't get to ignore HOA regulations just because they live here. These rules apply to everyone equally. Equally. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Alicia met Susan's eyes directly, her voice steady. When was the last time you stopped the Harrison family from having their pool parties? Or questioned the Millers about their 4th of July barbecue setup? Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. Those are family gatherings. This is clearly a commercial operation. Terrell raised his camera slightly. You see dollar signs when you look at us, don't you? Not a bride, not a celebration. Just profit you think doesn't belong here. The accusation landed hard. Gerald's face went from red to purple. Now you listen here. We're not about to be lectured by some outside agitator who thinks he can come in here and throw around accusations. Outside agitator. Alicia felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd had in countless corporate meetings where her ideas were dismissed before she'd finished speaking. But today was different. Today she wasn't going to smile and nod and try to make others comfortable with her presence. I want to see your supervisor, Linda said suddenly, pulling out her phone. Someone needs to explain to you people that this community has standards. You people. The words echoed across the lawn like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Kiana's hands tightened on the reflector. Terrell's jaw clenched visibly. And Alicia felt something inside her shift, a line being crossed that she hadn't even realized was there. My supervisor? Alicia's voice remained calm, but something in her tone had changed, something Linda should have recognized as dangerous. You want to speak to my supervisor about taking wedding pictures where I live? Yes, Linda said, fingers already dialing. Someone needs to teach you about respecting community guidelines and appropriate behavior. Alicia looked at Linda, then at Gerald and Susan, their faces set with the kind of righteousness that came from never being questioned. She thought about all the times she'd made herself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for her. All the times she'd explained herself, justified her presence, proven her worthiness to people who had never been asked to do the same. Then call him, she said quietly. Linda paused, phone halfway to her ear. What? Call my supervisor. His name is Marcus Johnson, but you might know him better as Mayor Johnson. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Gerald's mouth fell open. Susan's clipboard slipped in her hands. And Linda stood frozen, the phone still raised but no longer dialing. That's right, Alicia continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. Your neighbor, the one you're telling doesn't belong here, the one whose wedding photos you're trying to shut down. She's marrying the mayor of this city. The same mayor who signed the community development grant that paid for half the improvements you're so proud of protecting. Terrell smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Should I start taking pictures now? Because this moment right here, this is going to be memorable. But Linda wasn't finished. Her shock lasted only seconds before transforming into something harder, more desperate. I don't care who you think you're marrying. Rules are rules. And if you think dropping names is going to intimidate us, you're wrong. This community doesn't make exceptions for anyone. Even as she spoke, her voice carried less conviction than before. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, she was beginning to realize that this confrontation, this moment of assumed authority, might not end the way she'd expected. Alicia smoothed her dress again, but this time it wasn't from nerves. It was preparation. Because the real conversation was just beginning. Security needs to escort these people out immediately before this gets out of hand. Linda Hartwell's voice cracked slightly as she spoke, the earlier confidence replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like fear. She pressed speed dial on her phone, turning away from Alicia as if physical distance could undo what had just been revealed. Gerald Polk stepped forward, his earlier bluster now tinged with uncertainty. Look. I don't care if you're marrying the governor. HOA regulations don't make exceptions based on political connections. This is about property values and community standards. Alicia remained perfectly still in her wedding dress, the afternoon sun illuminating the intricate beadwork her grandmother had sewn with such care. You're right, Gerald. This is about standards. It's about the standard of respect you show your neighbors. The standard of courtesy you extend to people who live here and pay dues just like you do. Terrell adjusted his camera settings, the soft click of the mechanism cutting through the tension. I'm still waiting to hear which specific rule we're breaking. Taking photographs on community property, because I've seen plenty of other residents doing the same thing. Kiana shifted the reflector, catching Susan Brennan in its bright glare. She squinted, raising her clipboard like a shield. The rules are clearly posted on the community website. Commercial activity requires advance approval. This isn't commercial activity, Alicia said, her voice carrying the kind of patience that teachers use with particularly stubborn students. This is a bride taking pictures before her wedding. Pictures that will hang in my home, in this community for years to come. Linda finished her call and turned back, her face flushed with renewed authority. Security is on their way, and I've also called the police. Trespassing is trespassing, regardless of who anyone claims to know. The word claims hit like a slap. Alicia felt something cold settle in her stomach, the same feeling she'd had in college when a professor had questioned whether her scholarship was really merit-based. When colleagues had wondered aloud if her promotions were about diversity rather than ability, when people made her prove again and again that she deserved to be where she was. You called the police, she repeated, her voice still calm but with an edge that made Terrell look up from his camera. Linda lifted her chin defiantly. This community will not be intimidated by name-dropping and veiled threats. We have procedures, and we follow them uniformly. Uniformly. Alicia almost smiled at the word. Tell me, Linda, when the Kowalski family set up their entire graduation party last month, complete with a hired DJ and catering truck, did you call security on them too? That was different, Susan interjected quickly, too quickly. That was a family celebration. And this isn't? Kiana asked, gesturing toward Alicia's dress. What exactly do you think a wedding is? Gerald mopped his forehead with a handkerchief, the fabric already damp despite the mild temperature. Look, we're not trying to be unreasonable here, but there are proper channels, applications, approval processes. Alicia's voice stayed level, but something in her posture had changed, become more centered, more grounded. How many other residents have you required to file applications for taking photographs on community property? I'd like to see those records. Linda's eyes flashed. We don't owe you explanations about our administrative processes. Actually, you do. Alicia reached into the small clutch bag hanging from her wrist, pulling out a folded piece of paper. As a dues-paying resident, I have the right to review HOA enforcement actions. It's in the Community Charter, Section 4.2. The paper trembled slightly in Linda's hands as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the legal text. Where did you get this? I downloaded it from the community website, the same website where the photography rules are posted. Speaking of which, I printed those too. Alicia produced another sheet. Would you like to read the exact wording? Because it specifically mentions commercial photography for profit. Wedding photos for personal use are explicitly excluded. Susan consulted her clipboard frantically, flipping through pages with increasing desperation. That's not the current version. The rules were updated. When? Alicia asked. Last week, Susan said. Before or after you learned about my wedding. Because I submitted a courtesy notification to the front office on Monday, just to be polite, even though it wasn't required. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Gerald's handkerchief was forgotten in his hands. Linda stared at the papers as if they might transform into something more favorable if she looked hard enough. Susan had stopped flipping through her clipboard entirely. Terrell broke the quiet, his voice deceptively casual. So, let me understand this. You changed the rules specifically to prevent this wedding photo session, then called security and police when she followed the original rules that were in place when she planned this? We didn't change anything specifically, Gerald stammered. Rule updates are part of our regular review process. What a convenient coincidence, Kiana muttered, loud enough to carry. Just then, the sound of footsteps on the cobblestone path announced a new arrival. Tony Valdez, 42, the community security guard, approached with the weary expression of a man who'd broken up too many HOA disputes. His uniform was crisp, but his demeanor suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Mrs. Hartwell called about a disturbance, he said, his tone neutral and professional. What seems to be the problem here? Linda immediately launched into her rehearsed explanation, gesturing dramatically toward Alicia and her photography team. These individuals are conducting unauthorized commercial photography on private community property. They're refusing to leave despite being informed of the violations. Tony looked at Alicia, taking in the wedding dress, the professional photographer, the peaceful scene that hardly constituted a disturbance. Ma'am, do you live here? Building 47C, Alicia replied calmly. I can show you my lease if needed. Tony nodded slowly. And this is for your wedding? Yes, we're taking some photos before the ceremony this evening. He turned back to Linda, his expression carefully neutral. What's the specific violation? Linda thrust Susan's clipboard toward him. Unauthorized commercial photography, it's clearly stated in the regulations. Tony accepted the clipboard but didn't look at it immediately. Instead, he studied the scene again. A bride in a wedding dress, a photographer, an assistant, and 3 increasingly agitated HOA board members. Has anyone been damaged by this activity? Any property destruction? Noise complaints? Well, no, but, Gerald began. Any actual disruption to the community? The principle of the matter, Linda insisted. Rules exist for a reason. Tony finally glanced at the clipboard, reading quickly. Ma'am, these regulations refer to commercial photography for profit. Wedding photos are typically considered personal use. Susan snatched the clipboard back. The rules were recently updated to clarify the policy. When? Tony asked. Last week, she admitted reluctantly. Tony looked at Alicia. When did you plan this photo session? 3 weeks ago, she replied. I even sent a courtesy notification to the office, though I wasn't required to. The security guard's sigh was barely audible, but everyone heard it. He'd seen this before. HOA boards flexing authority they didn't actually have. Residents caught in the middle of power struggles that had nothing to do with actual community welfare. Ma'am, he said to Linda, I think there might be some misunderstanding here about the regulations. There's no misunderstanding, Linda snapped. I've been HOA president for 8 years. I know our rules better than anyone. But even as she spoke, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the afternoon air. Police cruisers, called by Linda in her moment of assumed authority, were now actually coming. What had started as a simple photo session was about to become something much more serious. Alicia heard the sirens too, and for the first time since this confrontation began, she felt a flutter of real concern. Not fear exactly, but awareness that the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. She thought about Marcus, probably still at City Hall, preparing for their evening ceremony, unaware that his bride was about to face police questioning on their wedding day. Tony heard the sirens too, and his expression tightened. Mrs. Hartwell, did you tell dispatch this was an emergency situation? Linda's chin rose defiantly. I told them we had trespassers who were refusing to comply with lawful instructions to leave. Trespassers who live here, Alicia said quietly. This ought to be interesting. As the police cars turned onto the community's main boulevard, their red and blue lights visible through the trees, Alicia smoothed her wedding dress one more time. But this gesture wasn't about nerves anymore. It was about preparation. Because she was beginning to understand that this wasn't really about photography rules or HOA regulations. This was about something much deeper, and the police were about to walk into the middle of it. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb with the kind of deliberate authority that made everyone step back instinctively. The sirens fell silent, but the red and blue lights continued their slow rotation, casting alternating colors across the manicured lawn and turning the peaceful afternoon into something that looked far more serious than a photography dispute. Officer Rebecca Davis, 38, stepped out of the first vehicle, her stride measured and professional. 23 years on the force had taught her to assess situations quickly, and what she saw didn't match the emergency call she'd received. A bride in a wedding dress, a photographer with expensive equipment, and a group of middle-aged HOA board members who looked more frustrated than frightened. Officer Miguel Martinez, 29, emerged from the second cruiser, younger but no less observant. He'd grown up in neighborhoods where police calls meant real trouble, and this scene had none of the markers of genuine disturbance. Still, they'd been called, so they'd respond accordingly. Linda Hartwell immediately approached Officer Davis, her clipboard still clutched like evidence in a criminal trial. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. These individuals are trespassing on private property and refusing to leave despite multiple requests." Officer Davis looked past Linda to Alicia, who stood quietly beside the photographer, her hands folded calmly in front of her wedding dress. "Ma'am, do you live in this community?" "Yes," Alicia replied, her voice clear and steady. "Building 47C. I've been a resident for 3 years." Officer Martinez consulted the notes on his phone. The call reported trespassers refusing to vacate private property. "But if you live here, how is this trespassing?" Gerald Polk stepped forward, his face still flushed from the confrontation. "She's conducting unauthorized commercial activities. This is a private community with strict regulations about business operations." Officer Davis turned back to Alicia. "Are you conducting business here today?" "I'm taking wedding photographs. For my own wedding. With a photographer I hired, yes, but for personal use, not for sale." Tony Valdez, the security guard, cleared his throat. "Officers, I should mention that I found no actual violations when I arrived. The regulations they're citing were apparently changed last week after this resident had already planned her photo session." Linda's voice rose sharply. "Since when do security guards interpret HOA policy? That's not your job, Tony." Officer Martinez looked at the small crowd that had gathered. Several residents had emerged from their homes, drawn by the police lights and raised voices. An elderly couple stood on their front porch, watching with concerned expressions. A young mother with 2 small children had paused on the sidewalk. Her stroller stopped mid-walk as she tried to understand why police had been called to their quiet neighborhood. "Let me get this straight," Officer Davis said, her tone remaining professional but with an undertone that suggested growing skepticism. "You called police because a resident of this community was taking wedding photographs on community property?" "She's not following proper procedures," Susan Brennan insisted, waving her clipboard. "Rules exist for everyone's protection and benefit." Officer Martinez walked closer to Terrell, who had been standing quietly beside his camera equipment. "Sir, are you the photographer?" "Yes, officer. Terrell Washington, professional photographer. I'm here to photograph Ms. Parker's wedding. These are personal photos for her album, not commercial work for advertisement or sale." "Do you have proper business licenses for your photography work?" "Yes, sir. City business license, professional liability insurance, the works. But again, this is personal wedding photography, not a commercial event." Officer Davis turned back to Linda, her patience beginning to show signs of strain. "Ma'am, what specifically do you believe these individuals have done that requires police intervention?" Linda's voice took on the tone of someone accustomed to having her authority unquestioned. "They're in violation of community standards and HOA regulations. When residents ignore the rules, it affects everyone's property values and quality of life." "But what law have they broken?" Officer Martinez pressed. "What crime are you reporting?" Susan stepped forward, consulting her clipboard with renewed determination. "Trespassing. She's using community property for unauthorized purposes." Officer Davis looked around the peaceful scene again, then back at Susan. "She lives here. She pays HOA dues. How is a resident using community property considered trespassing?" The technical definition of trespassing, Gerald began, his voice trailing off as he realized how weak the argument sounded when spoken aloud to actual law enforcement. Officer Martinez had heard enough. Ma'am, with respect, this appears to be an internal community dispute about HOA rules, not a criminal matter. We respond to legal violations, not policy disagreements. Linda's face flushed red. Are you saying you won't enforce the rules of our community? I'm saying we enforce the law, Officer Davis replied calmly. And taking wedding photographs on property where you live isn't illegal, regardless of what your HOA handbook says. Just then, a new voice cut through the tension. Excuse me, officers. Is there a problem here? Everyone turned to see Barbara Fleming, 67, a longtime resident who lived 2 buildings over from Alicia. She approached slowly, using a walking cane but moving with purpose. Behind her came David Sterling, 45, a neighbor who lived directly across from the community garden. Mrs. Fleming, Linda said quickly, we're handling a regulatory violation. Nothing for you to worry about. Barbara looked at Alicia in her wedding dress, then at the police officers, then back at Linda. You called the police on Alicia for taking pictures on her wedding day? The community has rules, Gerald said defensively. We apply them equally to all residents. Barbara's expression shifted, and decades of living through social change crystallized in her voice. Equally? Is that what you call it? She turned to Officer Davis. Officer, I've lived in this community for 12 years. I've seen graduation parties, birthday celebrations, family reunions, all with professional photographers. I've never seen police called for any of those events. David nodded agreement. My daughter had her quinceañera photos taken right here last year. Professional photographer, props, the whole setup. No one said a word about permits or applications. Linda's voice became defensive. Those were different circumstances. How exactly were they different? Barbara asked, her cane tapping against the cobblestones as she shifted position. Officer Martinez exchanged a look with his partner. The situation was becoming clearer by the minute, and it wasn't the kind of clarity that reflected well on the people who had made the police call. Alicia had remained quiet during this exchange, letting the truth emerge naturally from the voices of her neighbors. But now she spoke, her voice carrying across the gathering crowd. Officers, I want to be very clear about something. I've followed every rule that was in place when I planned this photo session. I notified the office out of courtesy. I've caused no damage, created no disturbance, and broken no laws. The only thing I've done differently from other residents is exist while black in a space where some people don't think I belong. The words landed with the weight of absolute truth. Officer Davis looked at Linda, whose face had gone pale. Officer Martinez consulted his notes again, then closed his phone with a decisive snap. Ma'am, he said to Linda, false reporting to police is itself a crime. Calling emergency services for situations that don't constitute actual emergencies can result in charges being filed against the caller. Linda's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time since this confrontation began, she looked genuinely afraid. Officer Davis addressed the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered. Folks, this is a civil matter between neighbors. There's no crime being committed here, no emergency, no threat to public safety. We're going to clear this up and let everyone get back to their Saturday afternoon. But the real resolution was just beginning, because word was already spreading through the community, and more neighbors were emerging from their homes. Some came with curiosity, others with concern, but all of them were about to witness something that would change Maplewood Heights forever. Alicia smoothed her wedding dress and prepared for what came next. Because if Linda Hartwell wanted to make this about rules and standards and who belonged where, she was about to learn that some conversations cut deeper than policy manuals. Word traveled fast through Maplewood Heights. Text messages, phone calls, and the unmistakable sight of police cars had drawn nearly 24 residents from their Saturday afternoon routines. They emerged from front porches and garden patios, some in casual weekend clothes, others still in aprons from weekend cooking, all drawn by the unprecedented scene of their neighbor in a wedding dress surrounded by police officers. Denise Foster, 41, arrived first. She lived in the same building as Alicia and had often exchanged friendly conversations while checking mail. Her voice carried clearly across the lawn as she approached. "Alicia, what in the world is going on here?" Before Alicia could answer, Linda Hartwell stepped forward, clearly hoping to control the narrative. "Denise, we're handling a routine compliance matter. Nothing for residents to concern themselves with." But Denise wasn't looking at Linda. She was looking at her neighbor in a beautiful wedding dress, surrounded by police officers on what should have been the happiest day of her life. "This doesn't look routine to me. Alicia, are you okay?" Alicia nodded, maintaining the same calm composure she'd held throughout the confrontation. "I'm taking wedding photos before my ceremony tonight. The HOA board decided that violates some rule they apparently created last week." More neighbors continued arriving. Isaiah Thompson, 35, a software engineer who lived in the building next to Alicia's, pushed through the growing crowd. "I got Barbara's text. They really called the cops on you for wedding photos?" Linda's voice rose defensively. "This community has standards and procedures. We can't make exceptions just because someone doesn't want to follow them." Camille Rodriguez, 52, a nurse who had helped several neighbors during the pandemic, stepped forward with her arms crossed. "Linda, I've lived here for 7 years. My son's high school graduation party had a professional photographer, catered food, and 50 guests. Where was the compliance concern then?" "That was family," Gerald attempted to explain, but his voice lacked conviction. "And this isn't?" Camille gestured toward Alicia's dress. "What exactly do you think a wedding is?" Officer Davis had been watching the crowd grow with increasing interest. The neighborhood's response was telling her more about this situation than anything the HOA board had said. "Ma'am," she said to Linda, "how many noise complaints or disturbance calls have you received about this photography session?" "Well, none directly, but," Linda began. "Any property damage, traffic problems, actual disruption to the community?" Linda's hesitation was answer enough. Officer Martinez made a note in his phone, then looked at the growing group of neighbors. "Have any of you been bothered by this photography session?" A chorus of no responses came from the crowd. Barbara Fleming spoke up clearly. "Officer, the only disturbance in this neighborhood today has been the HOA board making a scene and calling police on a bride." Isaiah stepped closer to Alicia, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who had seen enough. "Alicia, you know what this is really about. We all do. The question is what we're going to do about it." Linda's face flushed darker. "How dare you imply that this is about anything other than following community rules?" Denise let out a bitter laugh. "Rules that got changed last week? After Alicia's wedding was already planned? Come on, Linda. Do you really think we're all that stupid?" Gerald wiped his forehead again, the handkerchief now completely soaked despite the mild temperature. "Look, we're just trying to maintain community standards, property values, neighborhood quality of life. You all understand that." Camille stepped forward, her nurse's training evident in her calm but firm demeanor. "You want to talk about community standards? Let's talk about the standard of treating neighbors with respect. The standard of not calling police on people for celebrating life events. The standard of not targeting residents based on race." The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire everyone could smell, but few wanted to acknowledge. Susan Brennan clutched her clipboard tighter. "We don't target anyone based on race. We apply rules uniformly." "Uniformly," Isaiah repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. "Like how you uniformly approved the Johnson family's 4th of July block party last year, with no permits, no advance notice, and a band that played until midnight?" "That was different," Susan insisted weakly. "How?" Denise demanded. "How was that different?" Officer Davis had heard enough. The pattern was becoming clear, and she'd seen it before in other communities. "Ma'am," she said to Linda, "I'm going to ask you directly. Prior to today, how many times have you called police on residents for taking photographs on community property? Linda hesitated, trapped between honesty and self-preservation. This is the first time we've had to escalate to law enforcement. And how many times have you required other residents to file advance applications for personal photography sessions? Linda's silence stretched long enough to become an answer itself. Officer Martinez closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Ladies and gentlemen, there's clearly no criminal activity taking place here. This is a civil matter between neighbors, and frankly, it's one that should have been resolved with conversation, not police calls. Tony Valdez, the security guard who had remained quiet during the neighbor's arrival, finally spoke up. Officers, I want it on record that when I arrived, I found no violations of any community rules that actually exist. The regulations being cited were changed after this event was planned, and even the new version doesn't clearly prohibit personal wedding photography. Linda turned on him sharply. Tony, you're overstepping your authority here. Barbara Fleming tapped her cane against the cobblestones. No, Linda, you're overstepping yours. She turned to address the crowd of neighbors. How many of you knew that the HOA board could call police on residents for taking pictures in our own neighborhood? Murmurs of concern rippled through the crowd. Most residents had assumed the HOA handled administrative matters like landscaping and building maintenance, not that board members could summon law enforcement against neighbors they disliked. Alicia had been listening to her neighbor's defender, watching people she'd exchanged casual hellos with step forward to support her in a moment when she needed it most. But now she decided it was time to speak for herself. I want everyone to understand something, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. Her wedding dress rustled softly as she turned to address the full crowd. I didn't come here today planning to make a statement or prove a point. I came to take beautiful pictures before marrying the man I love. Pictures in the neighborhood where I live, pay dues, and plan to build a future. She paused, looking around at faces both familiar and new. But I'm glad this happened, because all of you needed to see who sits on your HOA board. You needed to see what some people do when they think no one is watching. You needed to see how quickly community standards become weapons when someone like me steps into a space where I'm not expected. The crowd had gone completely quiet, hanging on every word. This isn't about photography permits or advance applications, Alicia continued. This is about whether I'm allowed to exist in this space with the same comfort and dignity that everyone else takes for granted. And thanks to all of you being here, witnessing this, we have our answer. Linda made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. This community will not be intimidated by accusations of prejudice when we're simply trying to maintain order and property values. But her words fell flat. The neighbors had seen enough, heard enough, and understood enough. The real conversation was just beginning, and it was going to extend far beyond this Saturday afternoon confrontation. Officer Davis looked at her partner, then at the crowd, then at Alicia in her wedding dress. Ma'am, I hope you have a beautiful wedding ceremony tonight, and I'm sorry your special day was disrupted by what appears to be a significant misunderstanding about community rules. Alicia smiled, the first genuine smile she'd shown since this entire confrontation began. Thank you, officer, but honestly, I think this might turn out to be one of the most important parts of my wedding day, because these neighbors, these people supporting me right now, they're going to be my community for years to come. And now we all know exactly where we stand with each other. As the police officers prepared to leave, the real transformation of Maplewood Heights was just beginning. The black sedan pulled into Maplewood Heights with the quiet authority that comes with official license plates and tinted windows. Marcus Johnson, 34, stepped out of the passenger seat, still wearing his City Hall attire from the morning's budget meetings. His tie was loosened, his jacket slung over his arm, and his expression carried the weight of a man who had just received a very concerning phone call from his future mother-in-law. Marcus had been reviewing ceremony details with the wedding coordinator when his phone buzzed with a text from Denise Foster. Police at Community Garden. Alicia in trouble with HOA. Come now. The message had sent ice through his veins, not because he feared for Alicia's safety, but because he understood exactly what kind of trouble the HOA might create for a black woman, even one who lived there legally and peacefully. The crowd of neighbors was still gathered around the garden area, though the police officers had moved their vehicles to the side of the road. Marcus could see Alicia in her wedding dress from 50 yards away, standing with the same poised dignity that had first caught his attention at a city planning meeting 3 years earlier. But he could also see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands smoothed her dress, the signs only he would recognize of someone who had been pushed to defend herself when she should have been celebrating. "Excuse me," he called out as he approached, his voice carrying the practiced projection of someone accustomed to addressing crowds. "I understand there's been some confusion here about community regulations." Linda Hartwell turned toward the new voice, ready to assert her authority over yet another person she didn't recognize. "This is a private community matter, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." Marcus stopped walking, his expression shifting from concern to something cooler and more measured. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Marcus Johnson." The name hung in the air for a moment before recognition dawned on several faces. Gerald Polk's complexion went from red to gray. Susan Brennan's clipboard trembled slightly in her hands, and Linda Hartwell's confident stance wavered as she realized who she had just dismissed. "Mayor Johnson," Officer Davis said, stepping forward with professional courtesy. "We were just clearing up a misunderstanding about HOA regulations and photography permissions." Marcus nodded to the officers, then walked directly to Alicia, taking her hands in his without a word. The simple gesture spoke volumes about their relationship, about trust and support, and the kind of partnership that doesn't require explanation. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," Alicia replied, and she meant it. "Better than fine, actually. These neighbors have been incredible." Marcus looked around at the gathered residents, recognizing several faces from community events and city meetings. Then he turned back to the HOA board members, his expression calm but unmistakably serious. "Now, I understand there's been some concern about my fiancée taking wedding photographs in the neighborhood where she lives." Gerald stepped forward, his earlier bluster replaced by nervous energy. "Mayor Johnson, we had no idea. Nobody told us you were. I mean, we weren't informed that." "That I was what, Gerald?" Marcus asked, his voice still pleasant but with an undertone that made several people shift uncomfortably. "That the wedding was," Susan began, then stopped, realizing there was no way to finish that sentence without making things worse. "Let me see if I understand the situation correctly," Marcus continued, addressing the crowd but keeping his eyes on the board members. "My fiancée, who has lived in this community for 3 years and never caused a single problem, decided to take wedding photos in the community garden. She followed all existing rules, even provided courtesy notification though none was required. And in response, the HOA board called security and then police?" Camille Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "That's exactly what happened, Mayor. And they claimed she was trespassing in her own neighborhood." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Trespassing." Linda made one final attempt to justify their actions, her voice high and defensive. "We have to apply community standards equally to all residents, regardless of personal connections or political affiliations." "Equally," Marcus repeated, the same word that had been thrown around throughout this confrontation. "Tell me, Linda, what personal connections are you referring to?" Linda realized she had walked into a trap of her own making, but pressed forward anyway. "Well, obviously your position as mayor creates certain expectations of influence." Marcus looked around at the neighbors, many of whom had voted for him, supported his campaigns, and trusted him with their city's leadership. "So you're suggesting that I would use my position as mayor to help my fiancée break HOA rules?" Is that your understanding of my character? The question landed with the weight of a public accusation. Linda's face went pale as she realized she had just implied corruption by a popular elected official in front of 24 witnesses. Isaiah Thompson stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the group. Mayor Johnson, I want you to know that Alicia didn't mention your name until after they'd already called security. She tried to handle this as any resident would, following the rules and being respectful. They escalated this, not her. Denise Foster nodded agreement. She only revealed who she was marrying after they'd already decided she was some kind of criminal. They made assumptions based on how she looked, not anything she did. Marcus took a deep breath, the kind that precedes difficult but necessary conversations. He looked at Officer Davis, then at the crowd, then back at the HOA board. I want to be very clear about something because I represent this entire city, including this community. What happened here today wasn't about photography permits or advance applications or community standards. This was about bias. This was about assumptions. And this was about treating a black woman like she didn't belong in a place where she lives and pays dues. Gerald's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Mayor, we never intended. Intent doesn't matter when the impact is discrimination, Marcus replied firmly. What matters is that a resident of this community was harassed, questioned, and threatened with arrest for doing something that dozens of other residents have done without any interference. Barbara Fleming spoke up from her position near the edge of the crowd. Mayor Johnson, many of us have lived here for years and never seen the HOA board act like this before. This level of aggressive enforcement is new. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That raises important questions about what's changed recently in the board's approach to enforcement. Questions I think the community deserves answers to. Linda's voice cracked slightly as the weight of public scrutiny settled on her shoulders. We're volunteers trying to maintain property values and community standards. We don't have training in conflict resolution or civil rights law. Then perhaps it's time to get that training, Marcus suggested, his tone still measured but carrying undeniable authority. Or perhaps it's time for this community to consider whether the current board is serving the best interests of all residents equally. The suggestion hit like a thunderbolt. HOA board elections were normally sleepy affairs with minimal participation, but suddenly, every neighbor present was thinking about those upcoming ballots with new interest. Officer Martinez approached Marcus with professional courtesy. Mayor Johnson, we've determined that no laws were broken here today. This appears to be an internal community matter that escalated unnecessarily. Thank you, officers, Marcus replied. I appreciate your professionalism in handling what must have seemed like an unusual situation. As the police officers departed, the crowd began to thin slightly, but many neighbors lingered. They sensed that something significant had shifted in their community, something that went beyond wedding photos and HOA regulations. Alicia had been watching her future husband navigate this delicate situation with skill and dignity, never using his position as a weapon, but allowing his presence to reframe the entire conversation. Now she stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. I want everyone to understand something important, she said, addressing the remaining neighbors. What happened here today could happen to any of you. HOA boards have significant power over our daily lives, and that power can be misused if we don't pay attention. Today it was wedding photos. Tomorrow it could be your holiday decorations, your visitors, your children playing in common areas. The message resonated immediately. Parents exchanged glances, thinking about their own family's use of community spaces. Long-term residents considered past board decisions they had accepted without question. Marcus put his arm around Alicia, a gesture that was both protective and proud. This community has the opportunity to become a model for how neighbors treat each other with respect and dignity, but that will require all of you to stay engaged, ask questions, and hold your elected representatives accountable. Linda Hartwell, Gerald Polk, and Susan Brennan stood isolated now. Their earlier authority evaporated in the face of community disapproval and official scrutiny. The afternoon that had begun with them wielding clipboards and regulations had ended with them facing the prospect of recall elections and civil rights investigations. But the real victory wasn't in their defeat. It was in the way neighbors had supported each other, the way truth had emerged through collective witness, and the way a bride in a wedding dress had transformed a moment of harassment into a catalyst for positive change. As the crowd finally began to disperse, Marcus turned to Alicia with a smile that held all the love and admiration that had brought them to this day. "Ready to go get married?" Alicia looked around at the community garden where she had faced down prejudice and found unexpected allies, where her neighbors had proven themselves worthy of the trust that comes with sharing a community. "More than ready," she replied. "Let's go build that future we talked about." The Maplewood Heights Community Center had never hosted an emergency board meeting on a Saturday evening, but then again, the events of that afternoon had created unprecedented circumstances. Word had spread through text messages, social media posts, and old-fashioned phone calls that the HOA board was being called to account for their actions. By 6 p.m., nearly 60 residents had gathered in the meeting room that typically saw a dozen people at quarterly updates. Denise Foster had taken the initiative to organize the gathering, sending messages through the community's unofficial communication networks while Marcus and Alicia prepared for their evening wedding ceremony. The message was simple. If we don't address what happened today, it will happen again tomorrow to someone else. Linda Hartwell arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by Gerald Polk and Susan Brennan. Their earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the defensive posture of people who knew they were walking into hostile territory. Linda carried a briefcase now, as if legal documents might shield her from the community's questions. The meeting room buzzed with conversations that died as the board members took their seats at the front table. Barbara Fleming, using her cane for support, stood to address the room. "Since our regularly scheduled board president seems to have lost her voice this afternoon, I'll call this meeting to order. We're here to discuss the events that occurred today and what they mean for our community moving forward." Linda stood abruptly, her voice shrill with defensive authority. "This is not an official HOA meeting. The board hasn't called for emergency session, and proper notice wasn't provided to all residents." Camille Rodriguez stood from her seat in the third row. "Linda, 60 of your neighbors are here on a Saturday night because they're concerned about how you've been representing them. Maybe focus on that instead of parliamentary procedure." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Isaiah Thompson raised his hand from the back. "I want to know how many other residents have been targeted by this board for activities that were later determined to be perfectly legal." Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We don't target anyone. We respond to community concerns and compliance issues as they arise." Tony Valdez, the security guard, had been invited to provide his perspective on the afternoon's events. He stood slowly, his uniform still crisp despite the long day. "I've worked security for this community for 3 years. Today was the first time I was called to respond to a resident taking photographs. It was also the first time I was asked to remove someone who hadn't broken any actual rules." Susan consulted her clipboard with nervous energy. "The rules clearly state that commercial photography requires advance approval." "The rules that were changed last week?" asked a voice from the middle of the room, after Alicia had already planned her wedding photos. David Sterling, the neighbor who had witnessed the afternoon's confrontation, stood to address the board directly. "I want to know why my daughter's quinceañera photos were perfectly acceptable last year, but Alicia's wedding photos required police intervention today. What's the difference?" The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Linda attempted an answer. "Each situation is evaluated individually based on scope, impact, and compliance with current regulations." "Current regulations that didn't exist when she planned her photos," Denise interjected sharply. "Regulations that were created specifically to target her event." "That's an accusation we reject completely," Gerald said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then show us the minutes from the meeting where these new photography rules were discussed and approved," Barbara demanded. Show us the community notification that new restrictions were being implemented. Show us the democratic process you followed to change policies that affect all residents. Linda's face flushed as she opened her briefcase. Those minutes are being prepared for distribution at the next quarterly meeting. Prepared? Isaiah stood again, his voice carrying the frustration of a community that felt betrayed by its own leadership. You mean they don't exist yet? You changed community rules without meeting minutes, without resident input, without following your own governance procedures? The accusation hit home because it was accurate. The rule changes had been made in a hastily called phone conference between board members, motivated by their awareness of Alicia's upcoming photography session. There had been no formal meeting, no recorded votes, no community notification. A new voice spoke from the front row. Richard Hayes, 52, a retired attorney who had moved to Maplewood Heights 6 months earlier, had been taking careful notes throughout the discussion. I've reviewed the community charter and bylaws, and I don't see any provision that allows the board to modify regulations without proper notice and resident input. What you've described sounds like a violation of your own governance documents. Linda's composure cracked further. We don't need legal opinions from residents who haven't been properly briefed on community history and precedent. But Richard wasn't intimidated. Community history like the fact that you've never required photography permits before this week? Or precedent like allowing other residents to use community spaces for personal celebrations without interference? The room was warming to the cross-examination. More hands went up, more questions came forward, more residents demanded accountability for actions taken in their name without their knowledge or consent. Camille stood again, her nurse's training evident in her systematic approach to the problem. I want to know about the other complaints Natalie mentioned this afternoon. The ones that were buried rather than investigated. How many residents have been treated unfairly by this board? Gerald wiped his forehead with his damp handkerchief. Those are personnel matters that can't be discussed in open meeting. Personnel matters? David Sterling's voice rose sharply. These are community members, our neighbors, not your employees. If you've been mishandling discrimination complaints, we have a right to know. Barbara Fleming tapped her cane against the floor for attention. The fundamental question here isn't about photography rules or meeting procedures. It's about whether this board serves the community or serves its own assumptions and prejudices. The words crystallized what many residents had been thinking but hadn't articulated. This wasn't really about HOA governance or policy violations. This was about whether Maplewood Heights would be a community where all residents felt welcome and valued. Tony Valdez spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had observed the community's dynamics from a unique perspective. I want the record to show that the security protocols I was asked to follow today were not in my training manual and did not align with professional security standards. I was asked to remove a resident who posed no threat, caused no disturbance, and had broken no legitimate rules. Linda made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. This community cannot function if residents second-guess every board decision and question every enforcement action. We volunteer our time to maintain property values and neighborhood quality. We deserve support, not interrogation. But her words fell flat in a room full of people who had witnessed firsthand how that volunteer authority had been misused. The support she demanded had been forfeited by the actions she had taken. Isaiah raised his hand again. I move that we call for immediate resignation of all current board members and schedule emergency elections within 30 days. The motion was seconded immediately, then seconded again, then supported by voices throughout the room. Linda, Gerald, and Susan exchanged panicked glances as they realized their authority was evaporating in real time. Richard Hayes stood to address the legal implications. Under the community charter, a recall election can be triggered by petition of 25% of residents. Based on attendance here tonight and the community sentiment I've observed, that threshold will be easily met. As the meeting continued past 7 p.m., the wedding ceremony was beginning across town. But the real celebration was happening right here, in a community center where neighbors had discovered their own power to demand better from their elected representatives. The old Maplewood Heights, where authority went unquestioned and assumptions went unchallenged, was ending. The new Maplewood Heights, where residents held their leaders accountable and defended each other's dignity, was just beginning. While Maplewood Heights wrestled with its identity, Alicia Parker and Marcus Johnson stood in the soft glow of the historic Elmwood Chapel, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues. The ornate stained glass windows filtered the late evening sunlight into a rainbow of colors that danced across Alicia's wedding dress, making the beadwork shimmer like starlight. For a moment, the chaos of the afternoon felt far away. Alicia breathed in deeply, the scent of roses and lilies filling the chapel, and reminded herself that this was what the day was supposed to be about: love, commitment, and the future she and Marcus were building together. As the first notes of the organ swelled, Alicia began her walk down the aisle. Marcus turned to see her, his expression softening into pure awe. "You look perfect," he whispered when she reached him. "And you look like the man I've been waiting for," Alicia whispered back, her voice carrying just enough for him alone to hear. The officiant, Reverend Charles Miller, cleared his throat with the kind of gentle authority that drew everyone's attention back to the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness and celebrate one of life's greatest moments, the union of Alicia Parker and Marcus Johnson." Alicia felt the tension of the afternoon melting away as she stood beside Marcus, their hands intertwined, steadying each other. She thought about the confrontation in the garden, about the neighbors who had defended her, and about the lesson she had carried with her into this chapel. Dignity doesn't come from permission, it comes from within. As the vows began, Marcus spoke first, his voice steady and resonant. "Alicia, from the moment I met you, I knew you were more than the smartest person in the room. You were the bravest, the kindest, the strongest. Today, I promise to stand by you through every trial, every challenge, and every joy. I promise to make our home one where respect and love are never in question." Tears welled in Alicia's eyes, but she held her voice steady when it was her turn. "Marcus, you have shown me what partnership truly means. You have lifted me when I doubted myself and celebrated me when the world tried to silence me. Today I vow to walk beside you, to honor you, and to build a life where justice and love are inseparable." The words carried through the chapel, not just as promises to each other, but as declarations of the values they would carry into their marriage. The audience sat in reverent silence, many wiping tears from their eyes. When Reverend Miller asked if anyone objected, the silence was absolute. Not because there was no opposition, but because the strength of their bond made objection unthinkable. "By the power vested in me by the state," Reverend Miller concluded, his voice warm with conviction, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Marcus leaned in, and as their lips met, the chapel erupted in applause, cheers, and the joyous ringing of bells. Alicia felt herself lifted by the sound, by the love in the room, by the certainty that nothing the HOA board had done could diminish this moment. As they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, Alicia whispered, "Today didn't go as planned, but I wouldn't change a thing." Marcus smiled, squeezing her hand. "Neither would I, because today we didn't just get married. We showed everyone who we are." Outside the chapel, as the newlyweds emerged into the evening air, the crowd of well-wishers showered them with petals and cheers. And though the confrontation at Maplewood Heights lingered in their minds, tonight was theirs. Tonight was proof that love, when anchored in truth and resilience, could not be overshadowed by prejudice or small-mindedness. The wedding photographs they had fought so hard to take that afternoon would hang on their walls not just as memories of their marriage, but as symbols of a victory larger than themselves. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of a new week, but the events at Maplewood Heights continued to reverberate through official channels. Marcus Johnson sat in his City Hall office, reviewing the weekend's incident reports while sipping coffee from his favorite mug. What had begun as a wedding photography dispute was now generating inquiries from the Fair Housing Administration, the State Attorney General's office, and several civil rights organizations. Alicia had returned to her architecture firm, Parker Design Associates, where her staff greeted her with congratulations about the wedding and outrage about the HOA incident. Her business partner, Rachel Kim, 33, had spent the weekend researching legal precedents for discrimination in private communities. "What they did to you could constitute a federal civil rights violation," Rachel explained, spreading legal documents across the conference room table. "Housing discrimination doesn't just cover rental and purchase decisions. It covers the right to quiet enjoyment of your home, including common areas." At the offices of Henderson, Martinez and Associates, civil rights attorney Samuel Henderson, 47, was fielding calls from reporters and community advocates who had heard about the Maplewood Heights incident. The story was spreading through social media, legal circles, and civil rights networks faster than anyone had anticipated. Henderson had handled similar cases before, but the involvement of a mayor and the documentation provided by witnesses made this situation particularly compelling. Meanwhile, at Maplewood Heights, Linda Hartwell was discovering that her Saturday afternoon decisions were generating serious professional consequences. Her position as Regional Compliance Manager for Meridian Insurance Group was suddenly under review after company executives learned about her role in the incident. Insurance companies were highly sensitive to discrimination claims, particularly those involving housing and community management. Gerald Polk had spent Sunday night researching whether HOA board members could be held personally liable for civil rights violations. The answer, according to multiple legal websites, was yes. Board members who acted outside their authority or violated residents' rights could face personal lawsuits, even if they claimed to be following community policies. Susan Brennan had called in sick to her job as a county administrative assistant, unable to face questions from colleagues who might have heard about the weekend's events. She spent Monday morning consulting with an attorney about potential legal exposure and the possibility of resigning from the HOA board before recall elections could remove her. At the Fair Housing Administration's regional office, investigator Maria Santos, 41, was opening a formal complaint file based on a report submitted by Barbara Fleming. The elderly resident had documented the entire incident with careful precision, providing timestamps, witness names, and a detailed description of discriminatory statements made by HOA board members. The investigation would examine not just Saturday's events, but patterns of enforcement dating back several years. Santos had already requested all HOA meeting minutes, enforcement records, and community policy documents. The buried complaints that had been mentioned during Saturday's confrontation would receive particular attention. Richard Hayes, the retired attorney who had attended Saturday night's emergency meeting, was coordinating legal responses on behalf of community residents. He had identified multiple potential violations of HOA governance procedures, civil rights laws, and fair housing regulations. His morning was spent preparing formal complaints to state and federal agencies. At the district attorney's office, prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, 39, was reviewing police reports from Saturday's incident to determine whether criminal charges were appropriate. Filing false police reports was a misdemeanor offense, particularly when motivated by discriminatory intent. The documented statements made by HOA board members could support charges of filing a false report and potentially hate crime enhancements. Tony Valdez received a phone call from his security company's regional supervisor, asking for a detailed report about Saturday's incident. Professional security firms maintained strict protocols about appropriate use of force and legal authority. Valdez's refusal to follow improper instructions from the HOA board was being reviewed as a model of professional conduct rather than a disciplinary issue. The Maplewood Heights management company, Community Services, Inc., was conducting its own internal investigation. The company managed HOA services for dozens of residential communities and could not afford to be associated with discriminatory practices. Legal counsel was reviewing whether the company had adequate oversight procedures to prevent board members from making unauthorized policy changes. By Tuesday, 3 major civil rights organizations had contacted Alicia and Marcus offering legal support and advocacy services. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU, and the Southern Poverty Law Center had all identified the case as an example of housing discrimination that needed public attention and legal consequence. Local media coverage was intensifying as well. The Miami Herald had assigned an investigative reporter to examine HOA governance issues throughout the region. Television news stations were requesting interviews with principals and witnesses. Social media posts about the incident were generating thousands of shares and comments from people sharing similar experiences. The legal consequences extended beyond civil rights violations. The HOA's insurance company was reviewing coverage for potential discrimination claims. Property management contracts were being examined for violations of professional standards. Individual board members were consulting personal attorneys about liability exposure. But perhaps the most significant development came Wednesday morning, when the state attorney general's office announced a formal investigation into discriminatory practices by homeowner associations throughout the state. Alicia's wedding day confrontation had become a catalyst for examining systemic issues affecting thousands of residents in similar communities. The investigation would review HOA governance procedures, enforcement patterns, and complaint handling processes. Communities with histories of discriminatory enforcement would face particular scrutiny. The goal was not just to address individual violations, but to establish precedents that would protect residents from similar treatment in the future. Marcus Johnson found himself in the unusual position of being both a public official concerned about constituent rights and a private citizen whose family had been affected by discrimination. He recused himself from any official city involvement in the case, but made clear his support for thorough investigation of all civil rights violations. The legal machinery was now fully engaged, transforming a Saturday afternoon confrontation into a comprehensive examination of housing rights, community governance, and the difference between legitimate authority and discriminatory abuse of power. What had begun with an HOA president's assumption that a black woman didn't belong in her own neighborhood was becoming a legal reckoning that would affect similar communities throughout the state. 6 months after the wedding day confrontation, Maplewood Heights looked the same on the surface, but had undergone a profound transformation in its culture and governance. The community garden where Alicia had taken her wedding photos now featured a small plaque reading "Community Dignity Garden," a reminder that beautiful spaces belong to everyone who calls the community home. The recall elections had been decisive. Linda Hartwell, Gerald Polk, and Susan Brennan were removed from the board by margins exceeding 75% of participating residents. Voter turnout had been unprecedented for an HOA election, with nearly 400 of the community's 500 eligible residents casting ballots. The new board reflected the community's diversity in ways the previous leadership never had. Barbara Fleming had been elected president, bringing decades of community organizing experience to the role. David Sterling served as treasurer, Isaiah Thompson as secretary, and Camille Rodriguez as compliance coordinator. The 5th member was Dr. Ahmad Hassan, a cardiologist who had moved to Maplewood Heights 2 months after the incident, attracted by the community's reputation for inclusive governance. One of the new board's first actions had been to establish a Community Standards Review Committee composed of residents from different backgrounds and perspectives. Every HOA policy was examined for fairness, consistency, and compliance with civil rights law. Many regulations that had been selectively enforced were revised or eliminated entirely. The photography incident had sparked broader conversations about community governance throughout the region. The Fair Housing Administration had issued new guidelines for HOA compliance with federal civil rights law. The state attorney general's investigation had resulted in consent agreements with 12 homeowner associations, requiring anti-discrimination training for board members and transparent enforcement procedures. Alicia and Marcus had used their experience as a teaching moment, speaking at community forums, legal conferences, and civil rights workshops about the importance of civic engagement and resident oversight of HOA governance. Their story had become a case study in law schools and public policy programs across the country. The legal consequences for the former board members had been significant but varied. Linda Hartwell had lost her insurance industry job and paid a substantial settlement to avoid federal civil rights litigation. Gerald Polk had been required to complete community service and attend diversity training as part of a plea agreement related to filing false police reports. Susan Brennan had resigned from her county position and relocated to another state. But the transformation of Maplewood Heights extended far beyond election results and legal settlements. The community had developed new traditions and practices that reinforced inclusive values. Monthly block parties brought neighbors together across racial and ethnic lines. Community service projects engaged residents in shared efforts to improve their shared spaces. Town hall meetings provided forums for addressing concerns before they escalated to enforcement actions. The emergency meeting that had followed the wedding incident had evolved into regular community conversation sessions, where residents could discuss issues affecting the neighborhood and propose solutions collaboratively. These meetings consistently drew 60-80 participants, a level of civic engagement that made Maplewood Heights a model for other communities. Tony Valdez had been promoted to head of security for his management company, partly in recognition of his professional conduct during the incident. He now trained other security personnel about appropriate responses to community disputes and the importance of de-escalation techniques. Terrell Washington, the wedding photographer, had become something of a local celebrity after his role in documenting the confrontation. His business had grown significantly as word spread about his professionalism under pressure and his commitment to defending his clients' dignity. The Community Services Inc. management company had implemented new oversight procedures for all the HOA boards they served, including mandatory training on fair housing law and documented approval processes for policy changes. The company's legal department now reviewed all enforcement actions for potential discriminatory impact. Real estate values in Maplewood Heights had actually increased following the incident, as prospective buyers were attracted to a community with a reputation for inclusive governance and resident engagement. The negative publicity that Linda Hartwell had feared would damage property values had been replaced by positive coverage of the community's transformation. Alicia had been invited to serve on the city's Housing Discrimination Task Force, using her experience to help develop policies protecting residents throughout the metropolitan area. Her architecture firm had also expanded its practice to include community planning work focused on creating inclusive neighborhood spaces. The wedding photos that had sparked the original controversy hung in Marcus and Alicia's home, alongside framed newspaper articles about the case and thank you letters from residents in other communities who had been inspired to challenge discriminatory practices in their own neighborhoods. New residents moving to Maplewood Heights were given orientation materials that included the community's commitment to dignity and inclusion for all neighbors. The story of the wedding day incident was part of that orientation, not as a source of embarrassment, but as evidence of the community's capacity for growth and change. The physical improvements to community spaces had been significant as well. The garden area had been expanded and beautified with input from all residents. New playground equipment had been installed with accessibility features, ensuring that children of all abilities could play together. Community meeting spaces had been upgraded to accommodate larger, more diverse gatherings. Perhaps most importantly, the incident had created lasting friendships and alliances that crossed racial and generational lines. Barbara Fleming and Alicia had developed a close mentoring relationship, with the older woman sharing decades of community organizing wisdom. David Sterling's family had become regular visitors to Marcus and Alicia's home, their children playing together while the adults planned community improvement projects. The anniversary of the wedding day incident was now observed as Community Unity Day, featuring a festival in the very garden where the confrontation had occurred. Residents gathered to celebrate their shared commitment to dignity, inclusion, and neighborly support. The day included presentations about fair housing rights, workshops on conflict resolution, and recognition ceremonies for community members who had demonstrated exceptional leadership. Educational institutions had taken notice of Maplewood Heights' transformation. Graduate students in public policy, social work, and community development regularly visited to study how a single incident of discrimination had catalyzed comprehensive social change. The community had become a living laboratory for understanding how ordinary residents could challenge systemic bias and create more inclusive neighborhoods. The ripple effects had extended to other communities throughout the region and beyond. HOA boards in similar neighborhoods had proactively revised their policies and procedures after learning about the legal and social consequences that had befallen Maplewood Heights' former leadership. Real estate developers now marketed new communities by highlighting their commitment to inclusive governance and resident engagement. Training programs for HOA board members now routinely included the Maplewood Heights case as an example of how unconscious bias could lead to discriminatory enforcement and serious legal liability. Property management companies had developed new protocols requiring documentation and justification for all enforcement actions, particularly those involving residents who had not previously been subjects of HOA attention. The wedding photographs that had started the entire controversy had taken on symbolic significance far beyond their original purpose. Copies were displayed in the community center as reminders of the importance of defending every resident's right to full participation in neighborhood life. Similar photos from other residents' celebrations now adorned the walls alongside them, creating a gallery of community joy and inclusion. 2 years after the wedding day confrontation that changed everything, Maplewood Heights had become a destination for community leaders, civil rights advocates, and ordinary residents seeking to understand how neighborhood governance could prioritize dignity and inclusion over exclusion and control. The transformation was complete but ongoing. What had begun as a single bride defending her right to take wedding photos in her own neighborhood had evolved into a comprehensive model for equitable community development that was being studied and replicated across the country. Marcus Johnson stood in the Community Dignity Garden on a warm spring morning, watching children from the neighborhood play on equipment that had been designed with input from all residents. His mayoral responsibilities had expanded to include chairing a regional task force on inclusive community development, work that drew directly from the lessons learned in his own neighborhood. Alicia approached from their home, carrying architectural plans for a new community center that would serve as a model for accessible, welcoming public spaces. Her firm had been commissioned to design similar facilities in communities throughout the Southeast, each one incorporating the principles of inclusive design and community participation that had emerged from Maplewood Heights' experience. The original players in the drama had moved on to different chapters in their lives. Linda Hartwell had relocated to another state and was reportedly working in retail management, her career in insurance and community management having ended with the civil rights settlement. Gerald Polk had completed his community service requirements and was said to be keeping a much lower profile in his new neighborhood. Susan Brennan had disappeared entirely from public view, her social media accounts deleted, and her forwarding address known only to legal counsel. But their replacements had created something remarkable. Barbara Fleming, now 69, continued serving as HOA president with the energy of someone half her age. Her monthly president's reports had become newsletters that other communities requested permission to reprint, sharing insights about inclusive governance and community building. The Community Standards Review Committee had evolved into a permanent advisory council that helped resolve disputes before they escalated to enforcement actions. The council's mediation services were now sought by other HOA communities struggling with similar conflicts. David Sterling had established a nonprofit organization called Neighborhood Allies, providing training and consultation services to communities working to overcome discriminatory practices and build inclusive governance structures. The organization's first annual conference had drawn attendees from 43 states and 6 countries. Tony Valdez had become a national speaker on professional security practices in residential communities, emphasizing the importance of de-escalation techniques and civil rights awareness. His training programs were now required by several major property management companies for all security personnel working in residential communities. The legal precedents established by the case continued to provide protection for residents facing similar discrimination. Federal courts had cited the Maplewood Heights settlement in 12 subsequent cases involving HOA discrimination. The Department of Housing and Urban Development had incorporated elements of the case into updated fair housing guidance for private communities. Educational impact had been significant as well. 3 major universities had developed case study curricula based on the incident, using it to teach students in law, public administration, social work, and community development programs about the intersection of housing rights, local governance, and social justice advocacy. The community's transformation had attracted new residents who were drawn to a neighborhood with a demonstrated commitment to inclusion and resident engagement. The diversity that had concerned the former HOA leadership had become a source of strength and pride, with community events celebrating the cultural contributions of residents from many different backgrounds. Property values had increased steadily, contradicting predictions that increased diversity and resident activism would harm real estate markets. The community's reputation for inclusive governance had made it a destination for progressive professionals, young families, and retirees seeking neighborhoods that reflected their values. International attention had been unexpected but significant. Delegations from Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia had visited Maplewood Heights to study community governance models that prioritized inclusion and resident participation. The community's transformation had been featured in academic journals, policy reports, and media coverage throughout the English-speaking world. The wedding anniversary celebration had become an annual community tradition, drawing visitors from across the region who wanted to participate in the festivities and learn about the community's evolution. The event featured workshops, panel discussions, cultural performances, and recognition ceremonies for community members who had demonstrated exceptional commitment to inclusive values. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the example that ordinary residents could challenge discriminatory practices and create positive change through civic engagement and mutual support. The story had inspired similar organizing efforts in communities throughout the country, proving that social transformation could begin with individuals refusing to accept injustice in their own neighborhoods. Alicia and Marcus had used their platform to advocate for housing rights and community inclusion at state and national levels. Their speeches at civil rights conferences, policy forums, and community organizing workshops consistently emphasized that lasting change required sustained engagement, not just dramatic moments of confrontation. The children who played in the Community Dignity Garden would grow up in a neighborhood where their dignity was protected and their participation was valued, regardless of their family's race, ethnicity, religion, or economic status. They would inherit a community that had learned to resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than exclusion, to celebrate diversity rather than suppress it, and to measure success by how well the most vulnerable residents were treated rather than by how effectively different populations were separated. As the sun set over Maplewood Heights on this spring evening, the sounds of children playing, neighbors conversing, and community life flourishing filled the air. The wedding photos that had sparked a crisis had become symbols of resilience, dignity, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. The HOA president, who had demanded that a black bride leave her own neighborhood, had unwittingly catalyzed a transformation that would protect countless future residents from similar treatment. In trying to exclude, she had created inclusion. In trying to diminish, she had empowered. In trying to silence, she had amplified voices that would speak for justice for years to come. The real victory wasn't in the recall elections or legal settlements or policy changes, though all of those had been important. The real victory was in the community that had emerged from the crisis, stronger and more united than before, committed to ensuring that dignity and respect were not negotiable commodities but fundamental rights that belonged to everyone who called Maplewood Heights home.